So let's talk about a really crucial, super short period in American history that completely changed everything. We're looking at just 4 years, from 1898 to 1902. In that tiny window, the United States went from being a country that mostly kept to itself to a full-blown global empire. And, as you can imagine, that shift sparked this massive, fiery debate about what America was even supposed to be. At the turn of the century, America was quite literally at a crossroads, and you can see this tension perfectly in the political cartoons from back then. One of the most famous ones shows Uncle Sam actually using the Philippines as a stepping stone to get to China. So what was this all about? Was it a noble mission to, civilize the world, as some people argued? Or was it just a cynical power grab that totally went against everything the country was founded on? This one question just split the nation right down the middle.
To really get a handle on how America found itself in this mess, we have to start with the war that kicked the whole thing off, the Spanish-American War.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1898, and just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, things are getting really intense. The Cubans are in the middle of this brutal fight for their independence from Spain. Spain's reaction? This absolutely horrific reconcentration policy, where they forced civilians into camps and people were dying from disease and starvation. Meanwhile, back in the States, you've got yellow journalism, which was kind of like the clickbait of its day, splashing these sensational, often exaggerated stories all over the front pages, and it got the American public really fired up. With American businesses and citizens in Cuba at risk, the pressure on President McKinley to do something was just immense.
And then, you get the spark that lights the fuse. The American battleship, the USS Maine, which was sitting in Havana Harbor to protect U.S. interests, just explodes. More than 260 sailors were killed. Now, we still don't know for sure what caused it, but that didn't matter. The press and the public immediately pointed the finger at Spain. "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry that swept the nation.
The war itself? It was unbelievably quick. Congress declared war in April. By May, Commodore Dewey had already wiped out the Spanish fleet on the other side of the planet in the Philippines. By July, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were becoming legends in Cuba. And by August, it was basically over. Spain's old, crumbling empire was just no match for America's rising power.
Secretary of State John Hay really summed up the whole mood of the country with this one famous line. I mean, think about it. Fewer than 400 American soldiers died in combat, and the whole thing was over in a matter of months. To a lot of people, it felt like this glorious, almost easy victory. It seemed like a sign of America's destiny.
But while that splendid little war came with some very big and very unexpected consequences. The moment the fighting stopped, a whole new, massive problem began for the United States.
So the Treaty of Paris gets signed, and boom, the United States is handed what's left of Spain's colonial empire. All of a sudden, America is in charge of Guam, Puerto Rico, and, this is the big one, the Philippine Islands. The country had, almost by accident, become an empire with overseas territories.
What's really fascinating is just how baffled a lot of ordinary Americans were. A popular humorist at the time, Finley Peter Dunne, created this character named Mr. Dooley who just nailed the public mood. This quote says it all. Most Americans hadn't even heard of the Philippines before the war, and now, what in the world were they supposed to do with them?
And that feeling of confusion? It didn't last long. It quickly exploded into one of the most intense debates in all of American history. This whole question of what to do with these new lands forced Americans to take a hard look in the mirror and ask who they really were.
And this chart breaks it down perfectly. On one side, you had the pro-imperialists. They believed it was America's destiny to expand. They talked about it as a noble, civilizing mission, but also, and this was huge, as a massive economic opportunity, especially for getting into those Asian markets. They saw it as a way to make the nation stronger. But on the other side, the anti-imperialists were horrified. They argued that ruling over other people against their will was just plain wrong and a betrayal of the American ideal of liberty. They believed in the right of all people to govern themselves and were seriously worried about what becoming an empire would do to the country's soul.
The people who were for it, they were passionate. You had figures like Senator Albert Beveridge who talked about it like it was a moral, almost religious duty. For them, this wasn't about conquest. It was about America fulfilling its destiny to share its great values with the rest of the world.
But don't for a second think the opposition was some fringe group. No way. The American Anti-Imperialist League had some of the most famous and respected people in the country as members. We're talking about the great writer Mark Twain, the mega-industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and the pioneering social reformer Jane Addams. They saw imperialism as a poison that would corrupt America from the inside out.
And this whole argument wasn't just happening in newspapers or in the halls of Congress. In the Philippines, the dream of an American empire crashed head-on into a bloody, brutal reality, and it revealed the true, awful price of this new global power.
Now remember that number I mentioned, fewer than 400. That's how many Americans died in combat during that whole splendid little war. For such a huge victory, the cost seemed incredibly low.
Well, what happened next was anything but splendid, and it definitely wasn't little. America's attempt to take control of the Philippines led to a war against Filipino nationalists. It was savage, it was bloody, and it dragged on for years. The real bill for America's empire was about to come due. And here is where the story turns truly tragic. The Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had already been fighting Spain for their independence. They thought the Americans were heroes coming to liberate them. So you can imagine their shock and anger when the US decided to just become their new colonial ruler. So they turned their fight for freedom against America. It turned into this horrible guerrilla war, and many people at the time said it felt just like the brutal Indian wars that had been fought out west.
This report from a journalist who was actually there, it's just haunting. You can feel the chaos and the horror of it. This wasn't some glorious war with clear battles. It was a confusing, vicious, and soul-crushing fight in the jungles that really shocked the American people back home.
So by the time the conflict finally began to wind down around 1902, one thing was undeniable. America was now a major world power. It had a global empire, a powerful navy, and a seat at the big table. But it paid a steep price to get there, not just in blood, but in a serious challenge to the very ideals it was supposedly built on.
And that brings us right back to the one huge question that this whole era forced Americans to confront. It's a question that defined the debate then, and honestly, it's one that still echoes today. Should a country that was born as a colony, a country founded on the ideas of freedom and self-government, ever become a colonizer itself?